Not quite 20 years ago, I participated in a program called the Butler Summer Institute, a research opportunity for undergraduate students hosted by Butler University, which is the schmancy liberal arts college I attended with the help of every scholarship on God's green earth. My project was writing a script for a graphic novel, which I did, though the more important work was probably the novel I wrote at the same time, though neither the comic nor the novel was ultimately published. My partner, Tracy Rae Bowling, also participated in BSI. Their project was writing a play. I had admired them from my first week at Butler, where we both served as members of the literary magazine's editorial staff, but it was only toward the end of BSI that I found the courage to do something approximating asking them out. 1 year into grad school, we married. That's all a little bit beside the point, though. The point is that during that summer program, I broke my top left second molar by chewing on a pen, which is a habit I still have today. The pen was not at fault. The problem was my tooth. I needed a root canal. To pay for that root canal, I acquired a special credit card designed to cover medical costs. I couldn't tell you what made that card special. The interest rate was such that I didn't pay it off for something like a decade after. At any rate, the card bought me a crown, which survived until last year, when what remained of the original tooth died off to the point where it all had to be replaced by an implant. Over the course of some half-dozen appointments, the old tooth's remains were extracted, a screw was inserted into my jaw, and a hole was made in my gums that would allow the implant to be attached more or less permanently. All of this is to say that for most of this podcast's existence, I have been working with a significant gap in my teeth, which caused me to gain a slight lisp that I'm told was indetectable to everyone but me. I formed words differently to account for that perhaps imaginary speech impediment. I spoke carefully. My mouth feels strange again in a new way, but I think I can speak carelessly again. This is Library Pizza, a podcast about reading. I'm Mike Meginnis.
Library Pizza! P-I-Z-Z-A! Library Pizza! P-I-Z-Z-A!
It was recently announced that the Washington Post was finished with being a newspaper. Management used different words to say it. Their phrasing was that they were reducing staff and eliminating sections of the paper that didn't perform well enough to stay, but the announced reductions included the sports section of the paper, which is, in business terms, precisely equivalent to Jeffrey Bezos ordering his paper to drop dead. As best I can tell, the long-term plan for the paper is for it to serve as a glorified billionaire Substack covering national politics in the pages set aside for news, while the opinion section continues to devolve into a pale imitation of Barry Weiss's Free Press newsletter. Weiss did receive a fortune when Jeffrey's fellow mega-billionaire and pro-Trump propagandist acquired the Free Press and Weiss herself, so you could be forgiven for supposing that there is some value in this increasingly competitive space, but the whole point of the Free Press is that it has no value at all beyond what our oligarchs choose to invest, just like Weiss herself. To the extent that the Post could be fairly described as a struggling business, the blame lies entirely at Jeffrey's feet. His 2024 decision to spike the editorial staff's planned endorsement of Kamala Harris led to a historic number of canceled subscriptions, mine included. I struggled with accepting, and in fact choosing to accelerate, the end of the Post as a legitimate newspaper, as I had seen it as the better alternative to the New York Times ever since the Times helped lie us into Iraq. Back then, because I knew that journalists generally see themselves as liberals, I saw those lies as aberrations. It didn't seem at the time, and maybe it wasn't the case, that every major media outlet in the country was eager to support by any means available a reactionary agenda of warmongering, class warfare, and hate. The only questions that remain today are how recently they chose to enlist themselves in the fascist cause and how far down the masthead that is understood to be the project. In the case of the Times, it seems that anti-trans hatred is probably what poisoned the paper beyond all hope of recovery. Anti-trans hatred seems to function as a parasite that rapidly degrades its host organisms and ultimately destroys beyond all hope of repair their capacities for human thought and feeling, as we've seen take place quite publicly with the likes of J.K. Rowling and the New York Times' total institutional commitment to killing trans people and maintaining gender hierarchy has similarly ruined whatever was worth saving in its pages. Exceptions, like the writing of Jamel Bowie, are in but not of the paper. He remains worth reading precisely because his work is nothing like that of his colleagues. I was grateful when their book section reviewed my last book in 2022 and said as much publicly at the time, but I also tried to make it clear that this changed nothing about my assessment of their shameful anti-trans coverage. If you're giving them money, I must recommend that you stop. Jeffrey didn't kill the Post right away. When he first acquired the paper and for several years after, he seemed content to let the Post run itself more or less as it had done before, and journalists I more or less trusted said that he never interfered with their work, even when it touched directly on his interests. I won't speculate about what changed, but his refusal to allow the Harris endorsement made the shift impossible to ignore, and the paper's credibility collapsed, which kicked off a financial collapse that Jeffrey could still, of course, have happily weathered if he recognized the responsibility of stewardship that he had assumed with the paper's purchase. But now, here we are. The Post Sports section is dead, as is its international news apparatus, as is the books section, which was called Book World. And so now we ask ourselves, to what extent is the book world dead? It's difficult to assess just how much damage this loss will ultimately do to literature as a going concern. When it comes to book promotion, the Post has been for some time one of a very small number of venues that publishers believe capable of moving units. Even at major presses, publicity efforts for books seem to mostly boil down to submitting them for review in the Times, the Post, and NPR. Other publications receive review copies, of course, and authors happily tour podcasts to help spread the word, but none of that is actually expected to matter, and for the most part it clearly doesn't. What you really need these days is probably to be featured in a movie star's book club or on a morning show. Or maybe what you really, really need is a movie or TV adaptation. If nothing else, those talismans of success are likely to get an author's next manuscript considered seriously by editors at the small remaining number of major presses, although often those writers find themselves focusing on screenwriting going forward, to moderate or no success. I can confirm from experience that coverage in the Times and the Post is enough to sell some copies of one's book, but I can also confirm that doesn't necessarily help you enough. Losing the Post's Book World, which a write-up in the Literary Hub assured me has long been considered by industry insiders the gold standard, will likely make it more difficult to sell books in large numbers. Nobody really thinks that the system we had was working up until now, at least insofar as the system working means selling books with a healthy diversity of subject matter, approach, and style in sufficient numbers to provide authors with dignified careers and readers with literary lives that are rich, joyful, and nourishing. On Tuesday, February 10, The New Yorker published a piece by Becca Rothfeld, a literary critic and essayist who contributed to Book World, about the end of the Washington Post's book coverage. She writes, "There are still plenty of places to read about literature, many of them excellent. There are older and more established outlets like the London Review of Books and the New York Review of Books, cult favorites like Book Forum, and irreverent newcomers like The Drift and The Point, the latter of which I edit. These magazines are delightful and, in their own way, consistently surprising. I love reading them, and I have loved writing for them, but they are produced for an audience that already knows it cares about literature. The books section of a newspaper plays an altogether different role. It does not cater to aficionados, it seeks new recruits." This feels both true and false to me. Book World may have wanted new recruits, but I doubt that it often found many. I only ever saw their articles discussed when an author friend shared them to social media, gesturing at coverage of their own work as if to say, "See, I told you I exist." The main things I can remember reading there in the last few years are the two listicles that mention my own novel, one in 2022 when it was first published, and then another in 2023 when the paperback edition was sent out into the world to die without any real support. If I read anything else there, I'm sure that it was coverage of a friend. This is partly a matter of my own reading habits. As this podcast documents, I don't generally try to keep up with trends in my reading. I mostly spend my time, when I have the option, with books that are decades old, translations, or both. I don't look to newspapers, magazines, or even social media for help choosing what to read next. To be honest, I mostly couldn't tell you how I do it. Sometimes I see a book on a shelf, sometimes I remember something that somebody mentioned to me, sometimes I read for research. What I never do is seek out the new hotness. It doesn't even occur to me that I should try. This despite the fact that my own career is only possible because other people aren't like me. I need there to be readers who are interested in new work by American writers, but I can rarely find it in myself to pretend to be such a reader myself. I need venues like the Post to recruit such readers, but the evidence that such is possible is increasingly thin on the ground. Why don't more people read book reviews? Declining interest in literature itself is certainly part of the problem, but I can't help suspecting that paternalism on the part of the critical establishment is also a factor. To the extent that there are books capable of helping to recruit new readers, they probably exist in genres like romantasy, which critics and self-styled serious writers prefer to ignore when they aren't showering them with contempt. Looking at the front page of Book Forum, I see articles on Anthony Bourdain, Toni Morrison, and Daniel Berrigan, all dead. There is also an interview with Brandon Taylor, who is alive, and a review of a memoir by Arundhati Roy, whose work I haven't read, but her audience is vast, and she too is alive. Rothfeld's irreverent newcomers, The Drift and the Point, are far less welcoming to uninitiated readers. Feel free to pause this podcast, check both sites, and see if you can work out without substantial time and effort what books they're actually currently covering. You'll need to read some essays to find out. A reader who wanted anything but the driest possible literary fiction could probably find good recommendations in any of these pages, but these publications present themselves as if they only cover things that practically no one wants to read. I often wonder to what extent the problem is how few of the people involved in literature actually enjoy books and reading. While the people who work with books at the ground level do for the most part seem to genuinely like them, the people with the purse strings often seem embarrassed to not be in show business or Silicon Valley. And the ugliness of writing as a business often teaches writers to hate themselves, if not because they write at all, then because they write the wrong things, both insufficiently commercial and invisible to critics, who lack the numbers, the time, and the resources to keep up with the vast majority of what literature currently is. The literary community in the US, to the extent that such a thing exists, has taught itself that people don't read, don't want to read, and wouldn't like it if they tried. Even Rothfeld's pitch for the importance of book world, which is more positive in tone than most such efforts, focuses on the idea of introducing readers to things they don't want. The idea that people might actually enjoy buying and reading books is regarded as clearly insane by most of literature's strongest advocates. As an industry, we have undeniable loser stink. But it occurs to me as I write this that movies, music, and video games are all in similar places. Essentially, no one who works in any of these industries would say, or anyway has said in my hearing, that now is a good time for them either. And the venues for criticism of those forms are drying up too. Does no one want any kind of art? Is everyone content to veg with Netflix and YouTube all day? Or has the public so thoroughly subdivided and atomized into miniature publics that while there is money in making culture, no one can be quite sure how to find it, and for the most part doing so requires tapping into well-established fandoms built around intellectual property owned by billion-dollar corporations? I don't know. Historically speaking, the art I love best has mostly existed to lose money. It was patronized by people who didn't mind those losses, partly in order to serve communities who did not engage with the work, but did enjoy knowing that it was there and that it was good, or at least maybe prestigious. Most of the newspaper's pages were much the same. The book section didn't drive subscriptions, but it didn't hurt them either, and both the financiers and the audience enjoyed knowing it existed, that other people somewhere, most of which they didn't know, were enjoying reading and writing about books. If I'm honest, that's how I felt about Book World, and with its closure, that's what I've lost. We live in an age of analytics, returns on investment, and largely illusory perpetual market dominance. We have decided for the moment that we aren't interested in paying for the existence of nice things we don't personally use. But I think we could change our minds tomorrow. As oligarchs degrade our capacity to make and share culture, and as we respond by canceling our subscriptions to their hollowed publications, I can't help thinking that must create openings for new models and new ways of giving ourselves the permission we need to waste time and money on art for art's sake. I believe that we can give ourselves permission. I believe that we can love books if we want to. I've been wrong about practically everything every day, all the time for years now, and I've noticed that pattern. So while I'm not optimistic about the near future of books, I could be wrong. The end of book world could also be the beginning. Anything could. In any case, you'd be crazy to waste your own life not doing the things that you love. That said, I want to read a little bit of Orhan Pamuk's The New Life. This is a book about a person who is having his life transformed by an encounter with a book. And it's really earnest up front, I think. It is describing a real experience that people do have and that I recognize, but it's also, I think, quietly mocking the protagonist just a little and playing a little bit of a joke on the reader. I don't think that is immediately apparent in the parts that I am reading, but it does emerge as you continue to read and learn, for example, that the book that he's so excited about, he started reading it because he saw that a girl he liked was reading it. So that said, I hope you enjoy this little selection from that book, The New Life. I read a book one day, and my whole life was changed. Even on the first page, I was so affected by the book's intensity, I felt my body sever itself and pull away from the chair where I sat reading the book that lay before me on the table. But even though I felt my body dissociating, my entire being remained so concertedly at the table that the book worked its influence not only on my soul, but on every aspect of my identity. It was such a powerful influence that the light surging from the pages illumined my own face. Its incandescence dazzled my intellect, but also endowed it with brilliant lucidity. This was the kind of light within which I could recast myself. I could lose my way in this light. I already sensed in the light the shadows of an existence I had yet to know and embrace. I sat at the table, turning the pages, my mind barely aware that I was reading, and my whole life was changing as I read the new words on each new page. I felt so unprepared for everything that was to befall me, and so helpless, that after a while I moved my face away instinctively as if to protect myself from the power that surged from the pages. It was with dread that I became aware of the complete transformation of the world around me, and I was overtaken by a feeling of loneliness I had never before experienced, as if I had been stranded in a country where I knew neither the lay of the land nor the language and the customs. I fastened onto the book even more intensely in the face of the helplessness brought on by that feeling of isolation. Nothing besides the book could reveal to me what was my necessary course of action, what it was that I might believe in or observe, and what path my life was to take in the new country in which I found myself. I read on, turning the pages now as if I were reading a guidebook which would lead me through a strange and savage land. Help me, I felt like saying. Help me find the new life, safe and unscathed by any mishap. Yet I knew the new life was built on words in the guidebook. I read it word for word, trying to find my path, but at the same time I was also imagining, to my own amazement, wonders upon wonders which would surely lead me astray. The book lay on my table, reflecting its light on my face, yet it seemed similar to the other familiar objects in the room. While I accepted with joy and wonder the possibility of a new life in the new world that lay before me, I was aware that the book which had changed my life so intensely was in fact something quite ordinary. My mind gradually opened its doors and windows to the wonders of the new world the words promised me, and yet I seemed to recall a chance encounter that had led me to the book, but the memory was no more than a superficial image, one that hadn't completely impressed itself on my consciousness. As I read on, a certain dread prompted me to reflect on the image. The new world the book revealed was so alien, so odd and astonishing, that in order to escape being totally immersed in this universe, I was anxious to sense anything related to the present. What if I raised my eyes from the book and looked around at my room, my wardrobe, my bed, or glanced out the window, but did not find the world as I knew it? I was inhabited with this fear. Minutes and pages followed one another. Trains went by in the distance. I heard my mother leave and then return. I listened to the everyday roar of the city, the tinkle of the yogurt vendor's bell in the street, car engines, all the sounds familiar to me, as if I were hearing outlandish sounds. At first, I thought there was a downpour outside, but it turned out to be the sound of some girls jumping rope. I thought it was beginning to clear up, but then there was the patter of raindrops on my window. I read the following page, the next one, and the ones after that. I saw light seeping through the threshold of the other life. I saw what I knew and what I didn't know. I saw my life, the path I assumed my own life would take. The more I turned the pages, the more a world that I could have never imagined or perceived pervaded my being and took hold of my soul. All the things I had known or considered previously had now become trivial details, but things I had not been aware of before now emerged from their hiding places and sent me signals. Had I been asked to say what these were, it seemed I couldn't have given an answer while I still read on. I knew I was slowly making progress on a road that had no return, aware that my former interest in and curiosity for things were now closing behind me. But I was so excited and exhilarated by the new life that opened before me that all creation seemed worthy of my attention. I was shuddering and swinging my legs with the excitement of this insight when the wealth, the multiplicity, and the complexity of possibilities turned into a kind of terror. In the light that surged from the book into my face, I was terrified to see shabby rooms, frenetic buses, bedraggled people, faint letters, lost towns, lost lives, phantoms. A journey was involved. It was always about a journey. I beheld the gaze that followed me on the journey, one that seemed to appear in the least expected places only to disappear, making itself sought all the more because it was so elusive, a tender gaze that had long been free of guilt and blame. I longed to become that gaze. I longed to exist in a world beheld by that gaze. I wanted it so much that I almost believed in my existence in that world. There was no necessity even to convince myself. I did in fact live there. Given that I lived there, the book must, of course, be about me. Someone had already imagined my ideas and put them down. This led me to understand that the words and their meanings were, of necessity, dissimilar. From the beginning, I had known the book had been written expressly for my benefit. It was not because these were portentous phrases and brilliant words that every word and figure of speech pervaded my being. It was because I was under the impression that the book was about me. I could not fathom how I became subject to this feeling, but perhaps I did figure it out, only to lose it trying to see my way through the murders, accident, deaths, and missing signs with which the book was filled. So it was that as I read, my point of view was transformed by the book, and the book was transformed by my point of view. My dazzled eyes could no longer distinguish the world that existed within the book from the book that existed within the world. It was as if a singular world, a complete creation with all its colors and objects, were contained in the words that existed in the book. Thus I could read into it with joy and wonder all the possibilities in my own mind. I began to understand that everything the book had initially whispered to me, then pounded into me, and eventually forced on me relentlessly, had always been present, there, lying deep in my soul. The book had found the lost treasury that had been lying below the surface for ages, and brought it up. And I felt I could appropriate for myself what I read in between the lines and the words. Somewhere in the final pages, I wanted to say I too had come up with the same ideas. It was much later, after I had been totally overtaken by the world the book described, that I actually saw death appear in the half-light before dawn, radiant as an angel. My own death. I suddenly understood that my life had been enriched beyond my ken. Losing sight of the book was the only thing that frightened me then, but I was no longer as afraid of being unable to recognize what the book had told me of in the mundane objects around me in my room or in the street. I held the book between my hands and sniffed the smell of paper and ink that rose from the pages, just as I would do in my childhood when I'd finished reading a comic book from cover to cover. The smell was the same. I rose from the table and pressed my forehead on the cool window pane, as I used to do when I was a child, and I looked down into the street. 5 hours ago, shortly after midday, when I had placed the book on the table and begun reading, there had been a truck parked across the street which was now gone. Wardrobes with mirrors, heavy tables, stands, boxes, pedestal lamps, etc. had been unloaded from the vehicle, and a new family had moved into the vacant flat across the street. Since the curtains hadn't yet been put up, in the light of the bare bulb that lit the scene, I could see the middle-aged parents, the son who was about my age, and their daughter. They were eating their evening meal in front of the TV. The girl's hair was light brown, the TV screen green. I watched my new neighbors for a while. I liked watching them, perhaps because they were new or perhaps because watching them kept me safe. I didn't yet want to face the entire transformation of a familiar world now changed from top to bottom. But I was well aware that my room was no longer the same old room, nor the streets the same streets, my friends the same friends, my mother the same mother. They all implied a certain hostility, something dreadful and menacing that I could not quite name. I took a few steps away from the window, but could not return to the book beckoning me back to the table. The object that had taken my life off its course was there on the table behind me, waiting. No matter how much I turned my back on it, the inception of everything was there in the pages of the book, and I could no longer put off embarking on that road. Being cut off from my former life must have felt so horrifying for the moment that I, too, like other people whose lives have been irretrievably altered by some disaster, wanted to comfort myself by assuming my life would resume its former course, that it was not something terrible that had befallen me, some accident or catastrophe. But the presence of the book standing open behind me was so palpable to my senses that I could not even imagine how my life could ever return to its old track. It was in this state that I left my room when my mother called me to supper. I sat down like a novice unaccustomed to a new place and tried making conversation. The TV was on. Before us were platters with a stew of potato and chopped meat, cold braised leeks, a green salad, and apples. My mother brought up the new neighbors who were moving in across the street, my having sat down and, bravo, worked all afternoon, her shopping trip, the downpour, the evening news on TV, and the newscaster. I loved my mother. She was a good-looking woman who was gentle, temperate, and sympathetic. I felt guilty of having read a book that had estranged me from her world. Had the book been written for everybody, I reasoned, life in the world could not continue to flow on this slowly and this carelessly. On the other hand, it wouldn't do for this rational student of engineering to think the book had been written specifically for him. Yet, if it hadn't been addressed to me and to me alone, how could the world outside possibly go on being just what it was before? I was afraid even to think the book might be a mystery constructed for my sake alone. Later, when my mother washed the dishes, I wanted to help her. Her touch might restore me back to the present, from the world into which I had projected myself. "Don't bother, dear," she said. "I'll do them." I watched TV for a while. Maybe I could get involved in that world, or else kick in the screen. But this was our TV set, the one we watched, a lamp of sorts, a kind of household deity. I put on my jacket and my street shoes. "I'm going out," I said. "What time will you get back?" my mother said. "Shall I wait up?" "Don't, or you'll fall asleep in front of the TV again. Have you turned off the light in your room?" So I ventured out into the precincts of my childhood where I had lived for 22 years, walking in the streets as if I were in the danger zone in some strange realm. Damp December air touched my face like a light breeze, making me think a few things had possibly penetrated through from the old world into this new world that I had entered, things which I should soon come across in the streets that constituted my life. I felt like running. I walked briskly along unlighted sidewalks, avoiding hulking garbage cans and craters of mud, watching a new world materialize with each step. The plane and poplar trees that I'd known since my childhood still seemed the same planes and poplars, but they were bereft of their powers of association and memory. I observed the haggard trees, the familiar two-story houses, the grimy apartment buildings I had watched being built from the stage when they were mere mortar pits to the time when the roofs were raised and tiled, and where I played later as new playmates moved in. Yet these images did not seem to be inalienable pieces of my life, but photographs that I couldn't remember being taken. I recognized the shadows, the lighted windows, the trees in the yard, the lettering at the entrances, but the objects I recognized exerted no pull on my sensibilities. My old world was all around me, in the street across from me, here, there, everywhere, in the form of familiar grocery store windows, street lights at the Erincoy Station Square, bakery ovens still baking sorek, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but I'm guessing it's kind of bread, fruit cakes that belong to the greengrocer, push carts, the pastry shop called Life, dilapidated trucks, tarpaulins, tired and obscure faces. Part of my heart, where I carried the book surreptitiously as if it were a sin, had frozen against all the forms that were softly shimmering in the city lights. I wanted to run away from these well-known streets, away from the sadness of rain-drenched trees, the grocers and the butchers' brightly lit signs, neon letters reflected on the asphalt and in the rain puddles. A light wind rose, droplets fell off the trees, and there was a roaring in my ears that made me decide the book must be a mystery that had been bestowed upon me. I was gripped with fear. I wanted to talk to other people. At the station square, I made for the youth cafe, where some of my neighborhood friends still met in the evenings, playing cards, watching the soccer game, or just hanging out. Someone I knew from the university who put in time at his father's shoe store, and another from the neighborhood who played amateur league soccer, were at the table in the back, chatting in the black and white light reflected off the TV screen. In front of them were newspapers that had fallen to pieces from being read too much. 2 tea glasses, cigarettes, and a bottle of beer bought at the grocery and concealed on the seat of a chair. I needed to have a long conversation, maybe one that went on for hours and hours, but I soon realized I couldn't talk to these two. I was gripped with a sorrow that brought tears into my eyes for a moment, but I pulled myself together arrogantly. I could only bare my soul to the persons chosen from among those who already existed in the world implied by the book. That was how I almost came to believe I had total possession of my future, but I also knew what possessed me at present was the book. Not only had the book permeated my being like a secret or a sin, it had dragged me into the kind of speechlessness one experiences in dreams. Where were the kindred spirits with whom I could talk? Where was the country in which I'd find the dream that spoke to my heart? Where were those who had also read the book? Where? I'm going to stop there. Thanks for listening, and thank you to Tracy Rae Bowling, my beautiful partner, who provided me with my extremely dignified theme music. I'll see you next week. Thank you, Tony.